We're going to start off with the Thursday night game, which saw the Chiefs defeat the Eagles in Andy Reid's Philadelphia homecoming. Jamal Charles shredded the Eagles defense with 20 carries for 92 yards and a touchdown, while also dominating the Eagles as a receiver with 7 catches for 80 yards. He has put any injury concerns far behind him. While he didn't throw any touchdowns, Alex Smith managed the game well, throwing for 273 yards, finding Donnie Avery for 141 of those yards. It wasn't a great night for every Chief, however. Dwayne Bowe disappointed his fantasy owners with 1 catch for 4 yards. No reason to be overly concerned with Bowe, just a bad week. Michael Vick wasn't as productive as he was in the last 2 weeks, only passing for 201 yards and a touchdown, but he looked good as a runner with 95 yards on the ground. Unfortunately, he also threw an interception and had a costly fumble. He also took a hit and came up shaky in the fourth, but he said he would have been able to return had the Eagles needed him. LaShawn McCoy got off to a hot start before going down for what looked like a severe injury. He went straight to the locker room, but returned minutes later. Upon his return, he was amazing and showed no signs of injury, rushing for 158 yards and a touchdown. McCoy will probably be able to play through the pain, and his performance after returning to the game was extremely encouraging. Feel confident starting him each week. He looks like he's just hit his prime and remains on track for a huge year. Now we'll take a look at the Bengals versus the Packers, which saw the Bengals take the lead late and never look back on their way to a 34-30 victory. Andy Dalton was solid in victory, throwing for 235 yards and 2 scores. Giovanni Bernard continues to make strides in the Cincinnati backfield, with 50 rushing yards to go with his 4 catches for 49 yards. Jarvis Green-Ellis had 29 rushing yards and a touchdown, but also dropped a fumble in this one. Bernard is proving he's a more than capable pass catcher, and that could ultimately be what earns him more snaps than Green-Ellis. Both backs registered 10 touches each, and will be one of the more interesting running back combos in the league. In a relatively quiet game for AJ Green, he finished with a respectable 40 catches for 46 yards and a touchdown. As for the Packers, Aaron Rodgers put up a mildly disappointing performance with 244 yards and a touchdown. He also threw 2 interceptions that played into a Cincinnati rally. James Stark started the game, but would leave with an injury, clearing the way for rookie running back Jonathan Franklin to see some snaps. Franklin took advantage of the opportunity, rushing for 103 yards in his first NFL touchdown. With the Pack on bye this week, it's uncertain who will get the start at running back in Week 5, with Eddie Lacy due to return from his concussion. It's certainly something to keep an eye on. Even though he didn't add to his 4 touchdowns on the year, Jordy Nelson still finished with a respectable 8 catches for 93 yards. James Jones scored his first touchdown of the year to go with his 4 catches for 34 yards. In Dallas, the Cowboys manhandled the Rams 31-7. Tony Romo looked impressive with 210 passing yards and 3 touchdowns, one of which went to Dez Bryant, who also finished with 4 receptions for 38 yards. DeMarco Murray had a great day, with 26 rushes for 175 yards and a touchdown. He also added 3 receptions for 28 yards. As for the Rams, it was another miserable day. Sam Bradford finished with 240 passing yards and a touchdown to Austin Pettis. Dale Richardson aggravated his foot injury that kept him in a walking boot earlier in the week. He only played 1 snap before sitting out the rest of the game while Isaiah Paez filled in for him. Paez finished with 6 rushes for 20 yards while adding 7 receptions for 43 yards. He was mildly impressive. All signs point to Richardson returning in Week 4. It's uncertain which running back will get the start, but Richardson seems like the safer bet at this point. One of the more exciting games of the week, the Tennessee Titans connected on a touchdown pass with 15 seconds left to win 20-17 over the Chargers. Jake Locker was excellent, throwing for 299 yards and a touchdown while also rushing for 68 yards and another score. He looked good spreading the ball around, hooking up with Nate Washington 8 times for 131 yards and Kendall Wright 6 times for 71 yards. Chris Johnson was solid, rushing 19 times for 90 yards while catching a pass. I still like him as a decent running back too each week. Phillip Rivers wasn't as good as he had been the last 2 weeks, but it is somewhat expected against Tennessee's underrated defense. He finished with 184 yards and a touchdown to his partner in crime Antonio Gates, who added 55 yards on 5 receptions. Danny Woodhead showed glimpses of his New England days, being involved in both the rushing and passing game. I think he has very appealing flex potential. If you're really hurting on running backs, you may want to take a look towards Woodhead. Next we go to Minnesota, where the Browns pulled off a somewhat shocking victory only days after trading away their best player, Trent Richardson. In his first start, Brian Hoyer looked pretty good, throwing for 321 yards with 3 touchdowns. He did, however, have 3 interceptions which could have come back to haunt him had they lost. He made a pretty good case to take Brandon Weeden's job. We'll keep an eye on that this week. With Richardson gone, the Browns used the 3 running back committee with Willis McGahee's 8 carries leading the way for a lowly 9 yards. Until some of the dust settles, McGahee's the only back with some value at the flex at best. Josh Gordon returned from suspension with 10 catches for 146 yards and a touchdown. There are rumors he could be traded. If he can produce these numbers with Hoyer as his quarterback, then he could put up every week wide receiver number 2 numbers if he's shipped to a contender. Lastly, Jordan Cameron had another breakout performance with 6 receptions for 66 yards and 3 scores. He was one of the few players exceeding their preseason hype. It should be owned in all leagues. The Vikings fell to 0-3 on the season, but they don't look awful in doing it. Adrian Peterson led the way with 88 rushing yards and a touchdown to go along with 6 receptions for 27 yards. He did cough up the ball to DeQuell Jackson that kept the Browns alive. Christian Ponder threw for 228 yards, but did his most damage with his feet, rushing for 46 yards and 2 touchdowns, as well as a fumble. Cordero Patterson is showing some of his playmaking ability, but isn't going to win you any PPR leagues. If they can give him the ball more, he'll have a better chance of producing better numbers. In Foxborough, the Patriots cruised to a 23-3 victory over the Bucs. Tom Brady threw for 225 yards with 2 touchdowns and an interception. He found Kenbrell Tompkins twice in the end zone. Tompkins also finished with 3 receptions for 41 yards. Stephen Ridley was less than impressive for the 3rd week in a row, finishing with 11 touches for 35 yards and a catch for 8 yards. LeGarrette Blount actually finished with more carries than Ridley and was somewhat solid, finishing with 65 yards on 14 carries. It's uncertain if this is Ridley staying in Belichick's doghouse or just Blount getting carries against his former team in a game that never was close to begin with. Ridley's owners cannot be happy with the start to the season. It's definitely concerning right now. Tampa Bay failed to score a touchdown as Josh Freeman continued to underperform and is likely playing his last season in Tampa Bay. Doug Martin, as usual, was the only bright spot, rushing 20 times for 88 yards while also adding 2 receptions for 20 yards. Vincent Jackson had 3 carries for 34 yards, but left the game early and remained on the sideline. Things are an all-time low in Tampa Bay right now, and it doesn't appear to be getting any better. Outside of Doug Martin, there is no player who I expect is capable of putting up consistently strong fantasy numbers. In New Orleans, the Saints made relatively quick work of the Cardinals, winning 31-7. Drew Brees was typical Drew Brees, throwing for 342 yards for 3 touchdowns and added a rushing touchdown. Jimmy Graham hauled in 2 of those touchdowns, which added to his monster stat line of 9 receptions for 134 yards. Robert Meacham caught the other touchdown for his bi-weekly appearance. There wasn't too much to write home about for the Cardinals. Carson Palmer was the bad version of Carson Palmer, only throwing for 187 yards and 2 picks. I guess the most encouraging thing to come out of this game for the Cardinals is that Larry Fitzgerald was able to play, despite missing practice all week. Finishing with 5 receptions for 64 yards, he should be good to go for Week 4. In the nation's capital, the Detroit Lions were able to come away with a 27-20 victory over the Redskins, who fell to 0-3 on the season. Matthew Stafford led the way for the Lions with an impressive 385 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Calvin Johnson did his job, racking up 115 yards on 7 catches with a touchdown. With his 2nd straight monster performance, Calvin looks to be in line for another special season. Stepping in for the injured Reggie Bush, Jokie Bell enjoyed a great day, rushing 20 times for 63 yards and a touchdown, while also adding 4 receptions for 69 yards. Bell was impressive and should be dependable fantasy play even with Bush in the lineup. However, should Bush re-aggravate any injury, Bell's upside can only go up from here. RG3 managed to keep the Redskins close this week, rather than playing from behind as he had the last 2. He threw for 326 yards, which doesn't include an impressive 81-yard deep pass for a touchdown that was eventually ruled an incompletion. RG3 looks to be gaining some steam, but fears of any injury will hinder his performance each week. Alfred Morris rushed for 15 times for 73 yards with a 30-yard touchdown run. He's been consistent so far this year, and he's earned Mike Shanahan's trust. His job security is very safe right now. Pierre Garçon and Santana Moss both came away with over 70 yards receiving. Their value can only go as far as RG3 will let it. In Carolina, the Panthers dismantled the Giants 38-0. It was a great day for most of the weapons of the Carolina offense. Cam Newton had a solid day, throwing for 223 yards and 3 touchdowns, while adding 45 rushing yards and another touchdown. D'Angelo Williams looked good rushing the ball 23 times for 120 yards, and has been pretty good as the primary running back in Carolina this year. Jonathan Stewart is expected to be back week 7, but I don't see him being a real threat to take time from D'Angelo Williams. Brandon LaFell looked good with 3 receptions for 53 yards and 2 touchdowns. LaFell is capable of more of these types of games, but often just underperforms. This could be the game he needed to get it going. Ted Ginn has also been quietly consistent. He makes for a good sleeper candidate for the rest of the season. The Giants' offense, in comparison, looked miserable. Eli was sacked 7 times and was able to get any offense going. All his receivers suffered because of this. David Wilson continued to disappoint with 11 carries for 39 yards. Darrell Scott may sooner or later get more touches next week, just out of desperation. In Baltimore, the Ravens defeated the Texans 30-9. The Ravens' defense made it look relatively easy and was responsible for most of Baltimore's fantasy points. Joe Flacco only threw for 171 yards, but was efficient as a game manager. Filling in for the injured Ray Rice, Bernard Pierce was a workhorse with 24 carries, rushing for 65 yards and a goal line touchdown. Rice may not be back until week 5, so feel confident starting Pierce in week 4 and beyond, as he already had more carries than Rice even with Rice in the lineup. Torrey Smith has quietly been great to start the year. He racked up 5 receptions for 92 yards. Once he finds the end zone, his numbers will be even greater. He's been very consistent this year and is flourishing as the Ravens' #1 wide receiver. It was a relatively quiet day for the Texans. Matt Schaub only threw for 194 yards and hasn't been overly impressive to start the season. In that same vein, Arian Foster has also looked pedestrian to start the season. He only managed 54 yards on 12 carries, and to make matters worse, he was absent from the passing game. I was lukewarm on Foster going into the season, and he hasn't really done much to prove me otherwise. Competing with Ben Tate hasn't made him any better. Rookie DeAndre Hopkins continues to make strides, finishing with 6 catches for 60 yards, while Andre Johnson had 5 catches for 36 yards. Johnson left the game early with a shin injury. X-rays came back negative, and he should be monitored throughout the week. Now let's go to our first of the late afternoon games, which saw the Dolphins move to 3-0 with the win over the Falcons. Ryan Tannehill looked good throwing for 236 yards for 2 scores and an interception. Lamar Miller had 8 rushes for 62 yards and figures to see most of the snaps at running back. However, Daniel Thomas is beginning most of the goal line work, and this trend continued Sunday with Thomas scoring on a 5-yard run. Brian Hartline led the Dolphins with the 4 receptions for 56 yards. Mike Wallace had another slow week, only recording 2 catches for 22 yards. Wallace has elite talent, but figures to see his scoring fluctuate each week. However, he still possesses wide receiver 2 potential each week. In defeat, the Falcons managed to keep it close and actually held the lead for much of the game. Matt Ryan continued his strong play to the tune of 231 passing yards for 2 touchdowns and a pick. Filling in for Steven Jackson, both Jason Snelling and Jacquizz Rodgers took over the workload in the running game. While Rodgers outran Snelling on the ground with 86 yards rushing to Snelling's 53, Snelling had the better day in the passing game, with 4 receptions for 58 yards and a touchdown. With Roddy White still nursing an injury, Julio Jones continued his role as Ryan's go-to guy, with 9 receptions for 115 yards. He's starting to make his case to be a top 3 wide receiver next to Calvin Johnson and AJ Green. The Colts went into Candlestick to face the Niners and came away with a 27-7 victory. After acquiring Trent Richardson earlier in the week, there was some uncertainty as to how much he would be used and what that would mean for Ahmed Bradshaw. In response to this, Bradshaw had an excellent game, rushing for 85 yards and a touchdown. Richardson had the quieter game, rushing for 35 yards and a touchdown. Right now it seems like we're looking at a legitimate timeshare until one of these backs underperforms or gets injured. Both should be 100% owned as they are capable of being a very good running back combo. Andrew Luck was relatively quiet in this game, only throwing for 164 yards but also rushing for a touchdown. The 49ers were beat up again for the second week in a row. Colin Kaepernick disappointed fantasy owners with another single-digit dud. It is becoming increasingly concerning that Cap isn't showing much of a playmaking ability he showed in his Week 1 shredding of the Packers defense. This is probably due to the better preparation by opposing defenses and their ability to contain Cap. Frank Gore was decent, rushing for 82 yards and 11 carries. However, it was Anthony Dixon who nabbed the only Niners touchdown of the day. Vernon Davis sat out the game with a hamstring injury and is more than likely questionable for Thursday night's game against the Rams. What could only be considered a thrashing, the Seahawks welcomed the Jaguars to Seattle with the 45-17 victory. Russell Wilson was brilliant, throwing for 278 yards and 4 touchdowns. He connected on 2 of those touchdowns with Sidney Rice, which added to his 5 receptions for 79 yards. Golden Tate added 5 receptions for 88 yards, while Doug Baldwin scored his first touchdown of the season. Marshawn Lynch was relatively quiet, only managing 69 yards on 17 carries. The Jags were fortunate enough to walk away with 17 points after Seattle led up with a 31-0 lead in the third. After being a game-time decision, Maurice Jones-Drew rushed 19 times for 43 yards and a touchdown, but was mostly inefficient coming off the injury. Chad Henne was modest in throwing for 235 yards with 2 interceptions, while Cecil Shorts made the most of garbage time with 8 receptions for 143 yards. Jets and Bills squared off in a battle between 2 rookie starting quarterbacks. The Jets won 27-20 behind Geno Smith's 331 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Both of Smith's touchdowns went for over 50 yards. The first to Stephen Hill for 51 yards, and the other to Santonio Holmes for 69 yards. Both receivers finished with over 100 receiving yards on the day. In addition to an excellent passing day, Bilal Powell rushed for 149 yards on 27 carries. With Chris Ivory leaving this game with injury, the running back job is Powell's for the time being, and he looks to be taking advantage of it. The Jets clearly take the award for most surprising offensive outburst this week. In defeat, the Bills still managed to keep it close until the end. E.J. Mayo continues his solid rookie season, throwing for 243 yards and a touchdown to go with 40 rushing yards. C.J. Spiller had 10 rushes for only 9 yards and left with an apparent thigh injury. He didn't return, but early reports suggest he could be ready to play Sunday. With Spiller out, Fred Jackson took up Spiller's workload to the tune of 72 rushing yards on 7 carries, while adding 4 catches for 37 yards. Jackson has been a great surprise to start the season, and should be owned and started in most leagues for Week 4. Stevie Johnson managed 8 catches for 86 yards, while Scott Chandler added 5 receptions for 79 yards and a touchdown. Chandler's value could rise as he develops a rapport with E.J. Manuel. The Sunday night game, the Chicago Bears defeated the Pittsburgh Steelers 40-23. Jay Cutler played conservatively, but looked good spreading the ball around to his receivers, especially on a 33-yard touchdown pass to Earl Bennett. Brandon Marshall and Alshon Jeffrey finished with 5 catches each. Matt Forte continues his impressive start to the 2013 season, racking up 87 rushing yards with 4 receptions for 24 yards. Forte is re-establishing himself as an elite PPR player. He's looking like a wise investment for owners who waited past round 1 to grab Forte. The Pittsburgh Steelers offense finally produced some decent fantasy numbers, but still came home with the loss. Big Ben was very good, throwing for 406 yards and 2 touchdowns, both of whom went to Antonio Brown, adding to his 9 catches for 196 yards. He presents mid to low end wide receiver 2 potential. Jonathan Dwyer was the Steelers' best runner, but that isn't saying much. He only finished with 39 yards. Le'Veon Bell is expected to be back for Week 4 and could give the Steelers a much-desired offensive boost. In Denver, Peyton Manning continued his historic start to the season in a 37-21 Broncos win against the Raiders. Manning threw for 374 yards with 3 touchdowns, bringing his touchdown total to 12 on the season. With the offense built around him, he shows no signs of stopping anytime soon and is on pace for 77 touchdowns this year. Manning found Eric Decker 8 times for 133 yards and a touchdown, tuning out any chance of Decker seeing a decrease in catches after his quiet Week 1. Demaryius Thomas came away with 10 catches for 94 yards, while Wes Welker caught 7 for 84 yards and a touchdown. Julius Thomas continues to flourish as the main tight end in Manning's offense. He's going to put up top 5 numbers for the tight end position this year. The Raiders were never expected to hang close with the Broncos in this one, but had some encouraging moments, including Terrell Pryor's 73-yard connection with Denarius Moore for a touchdown. Terrell looked good as a passer and is showing a lot of improvement. He's shown good chemistry with Moore. Darren McFadden had a slow day on the ground, only rushing for 9 yards and a touchdown. He did, however, manage to throw a rare touchdown pass to Marcel Reese. While we may never see him do it again, it was definitely welcomed by his fantasy owner. That'll do it for Week 3 of Fantasy Football Express. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at RotoPlusFantasy. We'll see you next week.